The Forgotten Passengers of the Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic is one of the most well-known stories in modern history. It's been told countless times through books, movies, and documentaries. But when most people think of the Titanic, they picture the ship's grandeur, the luxury of first class, the wealth, and the opulence of an age that seemed unstoppable. What often gets forgotten are the people who were far from wealthy. The hundreds of men, women, and children who traveled deep below those grand decks in search of a new beginning. They were the third-class passengers, sometimes called steerage. And while their stories rarely made headlines, they made up the majority of those who were aboard. 1. Life before the voyage. To understand who they were, you need to understand the world of 1912. Europe was a continent in motion. Industrial cities were booming, but jobs were scarce for rural workers. In Ireland, entire villages lived in poverty, surviving on small farms or day labor. In Sweden, economic depression had left thousands unemployed. And in the Balkans, political unrest and hardship pushed people to look for a better life across the Atlantic. America represented hope. Letters from relatives already living there told of steady work, higher pay, and endless opportunity. And so, families sold land, livestock, or whatever they could to afford a ticket, often a one-way ticket, to a new world. For many of them, Titanic seemed like the perfect way to cross. 2. Boarding the ship. The third-class tickets were cheap compared to the luxury cabins above, but they still cost months of savings. Most passengers boarded not in Southampton, but at later stops, Cherbourg in France or Queenstown in Ireland, which is known today as Cove. Photographs from that day show long lines of families carrying heavy trunks, small children holding on to their mothers' skirts, and young men standing proudly in flat caps. They were excited, nervous, and full of dreams. Some had never seen a ship so large. At the dock, the Titanic towered over them, 4 city blocks long, gleaming white, with 4 great smokestacks reaching into the sky. To many, it looked like a floating city, a symbol that they were leaving poverty behind forever. 3. Life below deck. When they reached their cabins, they were surprised at what they found. For a third-class ticket, Titanic offered conditions that were almost luxurious compared to older immigrant ships. Cabins were shared but clean. There were proper beds, running water, and electric lights. Meals were simple: porridge, soup, stew, and bread, but they were fresh and filling. There were even small lounges and a general room where passengers could gather, play music, and socialize. People sang folk songs from home, Irish tunes mixed with Scandinavian ballads and Balkan melodies. Even with language barriers, friendships formed quickly. Many were headed to meet family already in America. Some planned to work in factories, while others hoped to buy land or open small shops. To them, the Titanic wasn't a luxury liner, it was a bridge to a new life. 4. The illusion of safety. The ship itself felt indestructible. Crew members and newspaper articles called it unsinkable. Passengers joked that even God couldn't sink the Titanic. And with that belief came a sense of calm. Few bothered to learn where the lifeboats were or how to reach them. The lower-deck passengers were never shown evacuation routes. Safety drills weren't mandatory. They had no idea that in just a few days, every deck, hallway, and staircase would become a maze of confusion and terror. 5. The collision. Late at night on April 14, 1912, the air was cold and still. Most passengers had gone to bed. The stars shone clearly above the North Atlantic, and the ocean seemed perfectly calm. At 11:40 p.m., lookouts in the crow's nest spotted an iceberg directly ahead. They rang the warning bell and shouted down to the bridge. The ship turned, but it was too late. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side, tearing open the hull in several places. In first class, the impact felt like a minor jolt. In the lower decks, it was a long, grinding roar, like steel being ripped apart. A few passengers woke up. Others barely noticed. But within minutes, cold seawater began to seep into the lowest compartments. At first, there was confusion. Some thought a pipe had burst. Stewards assured people that everything was fine. But as the minutes passed, the truth became harder to ignore. 6. The realization water poured in through the floors. Boots splashed as passengers hurried down the narrow corridors. A faint tilt in the floor made it harder to walk. Someone shouted that the ship was taking on water, but few believed it. Finally, orders came for passengers to put on life jackets and move to the upper decks. But this was easier said than done. To reach the lifeboats, third-class passengers had to climb several flights of stairs through areas of the ship that were unfamiliar. Signs were confusing and some doors were locked. The locked gates, meant to separate the classes, became deadly barriers. Panic set in as the lights flickered. Mothers tried to carry children and belongings at the same time. Men tried to help elderly relatives who couldn't climb quickly enough. In the chaos, many families were separated. For some, those final goodbyes happened in the dark, with freezing water rising around their feet. 7. Struggle and courage. Even in the middle of chaos, there were acts of bravery. A young Irishman was seen smashing open a gate with a piece of metal, helping dozens of people through. A Finnish woman led her younger siblings up through service corridors until they reached open air. Crew members guided small groups toward escape routes, often going back below to help others. But time was running out. The ship's lower compartments filled quickly. Water pressure forced doors shut. For every person who reached the upper decks, dozens more were trapped below. Up above, the lifeboats were being lowered, many half empty because people didn't believe the ship would actually sink. While the rich argued over who should board, hundreds of immigrants were still fighting to climb the last stairway. By the time the crew realized the full scale of the disaster, it was too late. Most of the lifeboats were gone. 8. The final moments, those who made it to the deck faced a different horror. The freezing Atlantic wind cut through thin clothing. Ice covered the railings. The ship began to list heavily forward, and passengers clung to anything they could. Music from the band still played faintly in the background, mixing with the sound of rushing water. Some jumped into the sea hoping to swim to lifeboats. Others stayed together, praying or singing quietly. A few comforted strangers in their last moments. When the ship broke apart just after 2 a.m., nearly all of the third-class passengers who were still on board were lost. 9. The survivors. Only a small number of third-class passengers survived the sinking, just over 170 out of roughly 700. Among them was Daniel Buckley, a 21-year-old from County Cork, Ireland. He later told of climbing toward the deck with several others and being stopped by a locked gate. They managed to force it open, but by the time they reached the lifeboats, most were already gone. Buckley found a shawl on the ground, wrapped it around his shoulders, and managed to slip into a boat disguised as a woman. Another survivor was Kate Gilna, also from Ireland. She and a few others were guided to a lifeboat by a sympathetic crewman. When she looked back at the Titanic from the water, she said it was like watching a great city sink beneath the waves. For those who lived, survival was both a blessing and a curse. Many were haunted by guilt for the rest of their lives. They had escaped, but so many of their friends and family had not. 10. Aftermath and inequality. When the Carpathia arrived to rescue survivors, reporters were waiting in New York. But the headlines focused almost entirely on the wealthy. The names of businessmen, aristocrats, and ship officers filled the newspapers. The third-class passengers were mostly listed as immigrants. No stories, no faces, just numbers. In the official inquiries that followed, much attention was paid to lifeboat shortages and navigation errors. But there was little discussion about how class differences affected survival. Statistics made it clear, most of the first-class passengers lived. Most of the third-class passengers died. The Titanic was more than a maritime tragedy. It was a reflection of the society that built it. A world divided by class and privilege, even in disaster. 11. Rediscovering the Forgotten. It took decades for historians to fully explore the experiences of the lower-deck passengers. For many, records were scarce. Names were misspelled or lost entirely. Whole families vanished, leaving behind no descendants to tell their stories. In the late 20th century, researchers began piecing together those lives. They used ship manifests, immigration records, and local archives to trace where people came from. What they found was extraordinary. The Titanic carried a cross-section of early 20th century Europe. Farmers, carpenters, teachers, miners, seamstresses, and young couples all united by one goal: to reach America and start again. Memorials now exist in towns across Ireland, Sweden, Finland, and the Balkans, each listing the names of those who left and never returned. Their families still remember them, even if the world forgot for decades. 12. The human side. Today, when we look at photos of the Titanic's wreck 2 miles below the surface, we see more than just steel and rust. We see shoes still paired together, children's toys, jewelry boxes, and letters that were never mailed. Each item belonged to someone, a real person with hopes, fears, and dreams. It's easy to think of history as a collection of facts and dates, but the Titanic reminds us that history is made of lives. The forgotten passengers weren't just victims of an accident. They were part of the great human story, the endless movement of people searching for something better. They represented courage, faith, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance of a new beginning. 13. Legacy and reflection. More than a century later, their stories still resonate. Modern researchers and descendants continue to uncover letters and artifacts that reveal what life was like for them. Museums around the world now feature exhibitions that focus not only on the ship's design, but also on the human side of the tragedy. In Belfast, where the Titanic was built, the visitor center dedicates space to the memory of every passenger, rich or poor. The forgotten passengers finally have their names restored. Their journey tells us as much about inequality and resilience as it does about shipbuilding and technology. It reminds us that progress, no matter how advanced, means little if compassion is missing. When you think about the Titanic, it's easy to picture the grand staircase, the music, and the luxury suites. But imagine instead the narrow hallways of the lower decks, the laughter of families on their first night at sea, the smell of fresh bread from the galley, and the quiet hope that filled those rooms. They weren't just passengers, they were dreamers. And though the sea took them, their stories continue to surface, piece by piece, like fragments of light rising from the deep. The Titanic will always be remembered as a tragedy. But for those who seek its true heart, the story belongs to them, the forgotten passengers who believed in a better tomorrow and gave everything to reach it.